Hey guys, tonight we wander into a corner of history that is both oddly meticulous and, frankly, kind of hilarious. Imagine stepping barefoot onto creaking tatami mats, the smell of smoke and ink hanging faintly in the air as you follow the glow of lanterns into the narrow streets of Edo period Japan. You pass shops closed for the night, shutters tight, but one place still flickers with life. The humble barber's stall, where a samurai kneels patiently while his crown is scraped clean and his hair folded into that iconic top knot. You're about to find out that hair, in this world, isn't just hair. It's honour, practicality, status, and sometimes the single string holding a warrior's identity together. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in a room where someone might duel you simply for touching their bun. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far these bedtime journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle deeper into the story, hearing sandals clack on stones smoothed by centuries of footsteps. The barbershops of Edo are unlike the sleek chrome-trimmed salons you know. These are modest wooden huts, more like shrines than parlours, their tools neatly arranged on lacquered trays. A razor glints, its blade honed sharper than the swords carried by the men who kneel here. The barber isn't just a tradesman, he's part surgeon, part confidant, part silent keeper of secrets. As he scrapes away hair from the crown of a samurai's head, the sound is soft and rhythmic, like someone slicing paper slowly in the quiet night. This shaved patch, called the shonmeiji, is about to become your main character. The shaved crown wasn't purely aesthetic, it was born out of battlefield necessity. Helmets in Japan's humid climate trapped heat, and warriors with full heads of hair quickly found themselves dripping, itchy and distracted. So they began shaving the top, leaving only the sides and back, which they could fold into a knot. Function dictated fashion. Historians still argue whether the earliest examples were strictly military hacks, or whether courtly influence nudged the style into wider practice. But either way, the result is the same. You're now staring at a scalp that gleams under lantern light. It's not glamorous in the way European powdered wigs were, but it has its own peculiar dignity. The shaved patch is smooth, almost tender, and contrasts with the carefully oiled hair drawn backward. You catch the faint scent of camellia oil, sticky and fragrant, holding the strands firm. Without it, the knot would collapse into something closer to a mourning bedhead than a symbol of samurai poise. Outside the shop, Edo breathes around you. Merchants pack up crates of pickles, children chase each other with paper lanterns, and somewhere a shamisen strums a melancholy tune. The barber finishes the crown, dusts stray hairs from the samurai's neck, and folds the long strands into a careful arc. You realise this is no casual style. Every gesture is ritualised, from the angle of the fold to the firmness of the tie. Samurai didn't just get a haircut. They maintained a visible badge of rank, and a reminder of discipline. You might joke to yourself that this is basically the world's first man bun. Sure, but unlike your co-worker's casual knot at the office, this one could literally cost you your life if handled wrong. The samurai rises, bows slightly to the barber, who bows lower of course, and steps back into the city. His shadow stretches long, the knot perched like a seal of authority on the back of his head. And yet, beneath the gravity, there's humour. Imagine sweating through August in Edo, when the air feels like soup. The shaved crown probably gave a fleeting sense of coolness, a relief from the suffocating weight of armour and silk. Did they grumble about razor burns? Almost certainly. One quirky tidbit. Some barbers kept tiny charms or talismans near their razors, believing they warded off infections from nicks, an early superstition mingling with hygiene. As you walk further, you notice knots everywhere, on soldiers guarding gates, on bureaucrats carrying scrolls, even on youths eager to signal their ambitions. But this hairstyle wasn't for everyone. Commoners imitated it in modified forms, but they knew full well that a true samurai knot wasn't just about looks. It was about belonging to a warrior class with codes, privileges, and obligations. To wear it without the rank was a gamble, an invitation to suspicion or worse. Still, you can picture a few cheeky teenagers sneaking off to barbers, asking for a miniature version, just to strut down the street before someone older cuffed them for daring too much. History is full of these little acts of imitation, tiny rebellions hidden under the cover of fashion. The night air cools, and the lanterns above you flicker. A soft breeze carries the smell of grilled eel from a food stall. You find yourself lulled by the rhythm of Edo's nightlife, the quiet continuity of daily rituals that kept an entire class of warriors bound together not just by swords and laws, but by hair, of all things. The top knot may look like a minor detail, but it was a thread woven through everything: identity, duty, shame, and pride. As you drift along, you catch another barber shop, this one closing up. He sweeps stray hairs into a wooden tray. You realise those scraps of hair once belonged to men whose lives could end in duels, battles, or retirements marked by cutting that very knot away. A strange fragility lies in the detail. A warrior might hold lands, wear armour, ride horses, but his honour could hinge on strands of hair and the razor's clean edge. The thought settles softly like dust. You tuck it away because tonight is only beginning, and there are more knots to untangle in the dim-lit streets ahead. You keep walking down that lantern-lit street, but now your focus sharpens on the curious bald patch you saw glistening on the samurai's head. It looks a little comical at first, like someone accidentally forgot the middle part of the haircut, but you quickly realise it's deliberate, precise, and crucial. This is the sakayaki, the shaved crown, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Every warrior passing by bears the same mark, like a secret membership badge you didn't even know existed. It began, historians say, as a purely practical measure. Heavy iron helmets, called kabuto, weren't exactly breathable. Imagine sweating buckets under the summer sun, armour digging into your shoulders, and your scalp itching like crazy. The shaved patch solved that. Less hair meant less heat, less sweat, and a helmet that didn't slip forward during battle. You may smirk thinking of it as ancient helmet hair, but to the samurai it was genius engineering. Still, historians argue whether its roots, pun intended, were strictly military, or whether courtly fashion trends nudged warriors toward bald elegance. The debate continues in dusty journals, but you can already see both sides as you glance between battlefield and banquet hall in your mind's eye. When you run your mental fingers across that scalp, you almost feel the smooth coolness. In fact, barbers back then sometimes used chilled water during shaves, which probably felt like heaven after trudging all day in armour. One quirky tidbit: records suggest some warriors rubbed rice paste on their shaved patch to soothe irritation. A sticky, slightly ridiculous skincare routine. Picture a hardened samurai, sword gleaming, scalp glopped with yesterday's leftover rice. Not quite the fearsome image woodblock prints promised. You stand by a temple gate and watch a group of young samurai laughing together. The shaved patch unites them, a shared marker that screams, "I belong here." In this society, everything is about signals: clothes, swords, even posture. The sakayaki is both function and fashion, but above all, it's about visibility. Without it, a samurai looked incomplete, almost suspicious. You imagine showing up to work in medieval Japan without that patch. You'd stand out like someone wearing pyjamas to a job interview. But what if someone resisted? Well, that wasn't really an option. The unwritten rule was that a warrior's head was just another canvas for discipline. The moment you entered samurai ranks, your hair stopped being your own. Your scalp became public property, so to speak, shaped by tradition and expectation. Refusing the shaved crown would be like refusing armour or a sword. Basically unthinkable. You pause and picture the act of shaving itself. The barber dips a blade in water, tilts the samurai's head, and drags steel across scalp. There's a crisp sound, and with it, the faintest sting. The shaved skin shines under oil lamps, and stray hairs drift down onto folded cloth. Somewhere outside, a cricket chirps, making the moment oddly tender. This wasn't a one-time ordeal, it had to be maintained constantly. Miss too many appointments, and your patch would grow fuzzy, ruining the clean aesthetic. Imagine samurai running around with 5 o'clock shadow, on their scalps, not very dignified. The deeper you lean into this detail, the more you see how strange yet serious it all was. Helmets did fit better, yes, but soon the shaved patch became symbolic. It meant you were a man of discipline, one who endured discomfort for the sake of order. In fact, Some sources say boys from samurai families had their crowns shaved early, training them to accept the style long before they wore armour. Like kids today squirming through their first dental appointment, they learned early that discomfort was part of honour. There's humour hidden in the image too. Imagine an entire army of warriors charging across a battlefield, the sun gleaming not off helmets, but off thousands of shiny bald spots, an accidental flash mob of reflective domes. Of course, you'd never laugh out loud in their presence. Touching a samurai's knot was grounds for violence, so mocking his bald patch probably wouldn't end well either. You stroll further and notice that not every bald patch looks the same. Some are wide, some narrow, some practically the size of dinner plates. The shape wasn't standardised, and scholars argue over whether different domains preferred different sizes. Some clans may have favoured big patches as a show of discipline, while others preferred subtler versions. Either way, once combined with the folded knot of hair at the back, the effect was unmistakable. One final observation settles on you like dust. The shaved crown reveals vulnerability. A samurai could armour his body, train his sword arm, sharpen his wits, but his scalp remained naked to the world. You imagine standing under a cold rain, drops drumming on your bare skin, seeping through, reminding you that honour often came with exposure. That's the irony. You shaved your head to fit the helmet, but in doing so you walked around with a sign of both belonging and fragility. And so you leave the temple gate behind, carrying that image of the gleaming bald crown in your mind. It isn't glamorous, but it is unforgettable, an emblem born from sweat, maintained with razors and worn like armour of its own. You drift deeper into the alleys, and now your attention shifts from the bare crown to what happens with the hair that remains. Those dark strands, slicked with camellia oil until they glisten under lantern light, don't just dangle aimlessly. They're gathered, folded, and tied into the famous topknot. This is the part you've probably seen in movies. The neat little loop perched at the back of the head, looking equal parts elegant and ridiculous. And yet, here in Edo, Japan, that fold of hair was more than a style choice. It was a statement, a passport, a calling card. The process looks deceptively simple. You imagine yourself sitting cross-legged while a barber takes the longer hair from the sides and back, combs it carefully, then folds it forward over the shaved patch before tucking it into a knot at the back. It's like origami, but with your own hair as the paper. The knot is tied tightly with string, often oiled so it doesn't fray. The end result is stiff, upright, and unmistakable. Without it, a samurai would look unfinished, almost like a soldier missing his sword. This folding style didn't emerge overnight. Historians still argue whether the earliest top knots were meant purely to keep helmets steady, or whether they carried ceremonial weight from the start. Some claim the shonmeiji developed out of older aristocratic fashions, where courtiers tied hair high to look refined. Others say it was strictly a battlefield convenience later dressed up with meaning. The truth is likely somewhere in between, a blend of necessity and vanity, much like most haircuts in history. Still, the symbolism grew. To wear your knot neatly tied and oiled was to declare discipline. A messy or sagging knot was shameful, a sign you were sloppy or careless. Think of it like showing up to a corporate board meeting with bedhead. You might get away with it, but everyone notices. Some warriors reportedly carried small combs tucked in their sashes, ready to fix stray hairs on the go. Imagine pausing before a duel, not to sharpen your sword, but to tidy your knot. There's a quirky detail that might amuse you. Some samurai used extra stiffening agents, like wax or even resin, to make sure their knot stood upright. One record mentions warriors complaining that their knots got so rigid they rattled against their helmets like doorstops. Not exactly the fearsome image you want to project, and yet it mattered. The knot wasn't just fashion, it was identity. Cut it off, and you stripped a man of his place in society. You picture groups of samurai gathered in tea houses, each knot subtly different. Some were slightly wider, some higher, some with an almost artistic arch. Within the rigid framework there was room for personal flair, just enough to let you say, yes, I follow the rules, but I'm also stylish. It reminds you of modern office workers, all in suits, but one guy sneaks in bright socks. The knot also acted as a visual shorthand for class. From a distance you could tell, here walks a warrior. Commoners could imitate versions of it, but theirs always looked a little off. less oiled, less perfectly folded, and importantly lacking the shaved crown. Without that gleaming patch, the knot was just a wannabe bun. And trust me, Samurai noticed. A farmer trying to strut with a false knot might as well have worn a sign reading, "Please insult me." You pause in your walk to imagine how the knot must have felt. Tight, stiff, and heavy with oil. Probably not comfortable. Sleeping on it might have required a wooden pillow, designed to keep the knot intact overnight. Historians still debate whether these pillows were common among warriors or just courtiers, but either way you wince at the thought of balancing your head on a block just to save your hairstyle. Modern gel doesn't sound so bad now. At festivals the knot gleamed in torchlight, a sign of pride. On battlefields it peeked from under helmets, reminding enemies they faced not just armed men, but a class bound by ritual. Even in death the knot mattered. Portraits of samurai fallen in battle often showed their hair intact, as if the knot carried their honour into the afterlife. That's a lot of weight to put on a few folded strands. You can't help but grin at one mental image. Imagine a warrior carefully grooming his knot in the morning, only to have a pigeon land on it while he walks through town. All that pride undone by bird feet. Did it happen? Maybe. Would it have ruined his day? Absolutely. So, as you wander on, the knot becomes clearer in your imagination. It's not just a hairstyle, it's a cultural fingerprint. Every fold, every glisten of oil, every careful tie says, "I am part of this world." Without it, you'd feel naked, dishonoured, or even cast out. With it you stand tall, even if you sometimes smell faintly of camellia and pigeon. You keep wandering, and the sound that pulls you now is a faint shk, the scrape of steel on skin. You peek through another open doorway and there it is. The barber shop in full swing, a place both ordinary and extraordinary. Inside, a samurai kneels politely on a cushion, while a barber leans in with razor poised, every movement deliberate. This isn't just a haircut. It's a ritual, half grooming and half theatre. The shop smells faintly of wet wood, oil, and the subtle tang of hair singed by candle flame. Tools are laid out neatly, combs carved from boxwood, small blades honed so sharp they could pass for miniature swords, and cloth strips for tying knots. The barber dips his blade into water, wipes it with cloth, then presses it gently against the scalp. Each stroke is smooth, pulling hair away in delicate strips. You hear it, like paper tearing slowly, and the sound is both soothing and slightly unnerving. These shops weren't exclusive to samurai. Commoners also came for grooming, but when a warrior walked in, the room adjusted. People hushed, eyes dropped. This wasn't just any customer. The knot he carried on his head wasn't simply hair. It was the emblem of a class that could draw steel at the smallest slight. And yet, here he was, bowing his head, trusting another man with a blade at his skull. That trust alone carried weight. Historians still argue whether barbers in Edo acted more like community centres than mere service stalls. Some accounts describe them as places of gossip, rumour, and even quiet political chatter. Picture it. A room where a samurai gets his crown shaved while overhearing whispers about taxes, trade, or which clan might be falling out of favour. In this sense, the barber's shop became a hub, a crossroads where personal ritual met public knowledge. One quirky detail. Barbers often displayed their razors like prized possessions. Some even gave them names, much like samurai name their swords. A razor could pass through generations, sharpened until it was as thin as paper. Imagine inheriting a blade not for fighting, but for shaving crowns smooth, still a weapon in its own way. You picture the samurai's patience. He doesn't fidget, doesn't yawn. Every moment is ritualized. A slight bow when the razor finishes, a murmur of thanks, coins exchanged with care. To treat the barber rudely would dishonour both men, and so the etiquette of the cut itself became a performance of respect. Of course, not everything was solemn. Picture a barber's apprentice sweeping up stray hairs while muttering about how one customer's knot looked like a lopsided dumpling. Human nature doesn't change much. There must have been jokes, quiet, careful ones, about knots too small, too greasy, or too crooked. One surviving comic print even shows a barber falling asleep mid-shave, blade in hand, customer wide-eyed in panic. Not exactly the dignified image the warrior class preferred, but dignity required upkeep. The knot wasn't permanent. It demanded constant trimming, shaving, and oiling. Miss your visits, and the shaved crown fuzzed over, spoiling the look. Too much oil, and your knot glistened like fried tempura. Not enough, and it drooped pitifully. The barber had to balance all of it, a mix of craft and artistry. You paused to consider the strangeness. An entire social class bound together not only by swords and armour, but by the cadence of razors in wooden stalls. You can almost hear the rhythm as background music to Edo life, the scrape, the tie, the bow, repeated endlessly across the city. And you realise, this is the texture of history, not just battles and treaties, but the small rituals of everyday life, carried out in quiet rooms, where men surrendered their pride for an hour to maintain the symbol that defined them. Outside, you step back into the street. The lanterns flicker, voices hum, and you carry with you the echo of that razor, that soft whisper of steel across skin, reminding you that even warriors needed barbers, and that even honour needed maintenance. You walk farther into the cityscape, and now your eye is drawn not to the scrape of the razor, but to the knot itself, perched proudly, glistening in the firelight, and whispering volumes about the man who wears it. You quickly realise these knots are more than just tidy buns of hair. They're signals, a silent language understood instantly by anyone in Edo. Some knots stand tall and stiff, announcing wealth and discipline. Others are slimmer, looser, perhaps signalling a man of lower rank or someone who hadn't oiled his hair as carefully that morning. You glance from warrior to warrior and see a subtle spectrum. The size of the knot, the tilt of its fold, the shine of its strands, all tiny clues hinting at where each man sits in the great social puzzle of the Tokugawa shogunate. Historians still argue whether strict rules dictated knot style or whether unwritten custom carried more weight. Some surviving texts suggest that certain clans preferred flatter knots, while others celebrated tall, arching versions. And then there's debate over whether knots became more exaggerated as status symbols during peaceful Edo years, when warriors had less fighting to do and more time to compete in appearances. Like medieval fashion arms races, the knot may have grown taller, shinier, and fussier, simply because men wanted to outdo each other. A quirky tidbit slides in here. One travel diary from the 18th century jokes that some knots were so stiff with oil they could double as paperweights. Imagine leaning over your desk, the knot knocking ink bottles askew. Not exactly what you expect from a symbol of honour. Still, it mattered. A gleaming knot told the world you were disciplined, wealthy enough to buy oil, and attentive to the rituals of your class. A sloppy knot told a different story, one of carelessness or even quiet rebellion. You picture a young samurai strolling down the street, not just a little too loose, daring others to notice. Maybe he wanted to test boundaries, or maybe he simply overslept. Either way, his hair said what his mouth did not. The barber's hand, then, wasn't just maintaining hair, it was shaping identity. To leave with a knot slightly tilted or uneven could spark gossip. In a society obsessed with etiquette, whispers about your appearance carried weight. A crooked knot might suggest a crooked character. Think of it like someone showing up at court with a stained robe. It didn't just embarrass you, it embarrassed the group you represented. As you watch, you see how this silent language threads through daily life. At the marketplace, merchants bow slightly deeper to a warrior with a tall, gleaming knot, signalling they recognize his standing. At the temple, an elder samurai scolds a younger one whose knot droops over his shaved patch. At a tea house, whispers rise when a man with a suspiciously plain knot enters. Was he truly of rank, or just playing dress-up? And then there's the battlefield. Helmets hid much of the knot, but when the helmets came off after victory or defeat, the knot reappeared as a measure of dignity. Captured warriors were often mocked for having their knots dishevelled, as though their very honour had been frayed alongside their hair. It's here that you notice the paradox. A knot was both practical and theatrical. It had to withstand sweat, helmets, and rain, yet also remain pristine enough to signal rank. This tension meant constant care. Oil applied daily, ties tightened, loose hairs trimmed. Maintaining a knot was a job in itself, one that demanded the same discipline as sword practice or calligraphy. But despite all the effort, a flash of humour sneaks in. Imagine standing in a line of warriors, all knots carefully tied, when a sudden gust of wind flips one sideways. Honour undone by weather. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you suspect Edo poets must have written haiku about such moments, though perhaps they phrased them more delicately. You stroll past another barber shop, where a young apprentice sweeps discarded hair. The scraps look ordinary, yet they once carried immense meaning. To cut them off carelessly would be to discard more than strands. It would be to tamper with identity. That's the quiet weight every knot carried, silently resting on the nape of each warrior's neck. So you walk on, lanterns glowing faintly overhead, and the knots all around you shimmer in the night. They're not just hairstyles. They're social codes, tiny emblems of rank, fragile crowns of oil and thread that told everyone exactly who you were. You continue your quiet stroll, and now your focus narrows to something subtle but razor-sharp in its consequences. The etiquette surrounding the top knot itself. It isn't just about keeping it neat, it's about guarding it like sacred ground. The knot was a symbol of status, pride, and belonging, so much so that the slightest breach of etiquette could light the fuse of violence. Imagine yourself stepping into a bustling tea house. The air smells of roasted barley tea and faint incense. Chatter buzzes around you, and there in the corner sit 3 samurai, their knots gleaming under lantern light. Everyone gives them space, not just out of respect for their swords, but for their hair. You take a wrong step, maybe stumble in the crowd, and oh no! You brush your hand against one man's knot. In today's world, that's just a clumsy accident. In Edo, Japan, that could be cause for a duel. Touching another man's knot was the ultimate insult, the equivalent of spitting on his honour. Historians still argue whether the taboo originated purely in warrior culture, or whether it drew on older religious notions about the sanctity of the head. In Shinto belief, the head often symbolised the seat of the spirit, and some scholars think the knot became an extension of that sacred space. Others say it was entirely about pride. The knot was the badge of being a samurai, so laying hands on it was like tearing stripes off a soldier's uniform. Either way, the effect was the same: untouchable. One quirky detail: satirical prints from the Edo period sometimes joked about bumbling townsfolk who accidentally tugged a samurai's knot, only to flee for their lives. It was a stock comedy trope, like slipping on a banana peel in modern cartoons. Audiences laughed because they knew how deadly serious the real thing could be. As you picture this, you realise how much weight rested on something so delicate. A knot wasn't armour, wasn't steel, wasn't land or wealth. It was strands of hair folded and tied, and yet it could make or break reputations. That's why etiquette rules sprang up around it. Don't touch, don't mock, don't even glance too long, unless you wanted trouble. You wander further into a festival crowd, lanterns bobbing in the night. Drums thrum, people laugh, food stalls sizzle, and yet the samurai here still carry themselves with invisible boundaries around their knots. Even children know better than to reach for them. A little boy tugging at the wrong man's bun could spark chaos, and so mothers yank their kids back quickly, whispering sharp warnings. Of course, there were exceptions. Within families, wives sometimes helped oil or retie knots, and fathers trained sons by teaching them how to fold their own. In that private setting, the knot became a shared act of intimacy and continuity. Outside, though, hands off. The contrast is striking. What was tender at home was untouchable in public. You imagine how exhausting it must have been, walking around with such a fragile yet sacred emblem perched on your head. Rain, wind, or accidents could all threaten it. And yet, the etiquette kept it safe, protected not by helmets, but by social codes. The knot, then, wasn't just about identity. It was about invisible fences of respect. There's even a darker edge. Samurai could and did use knot etiquette as a pretext for fights. A man might accuse another of brushing against his knot just to escalate into a duel, especially if he wanted an excuse to settle grudges. In this sense, the knot was both shield and sword. It protected honour but also offered a ready spark for violence. And then comes the humour you can't quite suppress. Imagine a drunken samurai staggering home after too much sake, his knot lopsided, inviting comments. A brave or foolish friend might reach out to straighten it, only to risk being cut down for insulting him. Hair etiquette taken to deadly extremes. As you watch knots sway in the torchlight, you realise you're no longer just seeing hairstyles. You're seeing invisible webs of power, pride and peril spun around each one. Every knot carries not just strands of hair, but strands of expectation. And to touch one without leave is to cut those strands, unravelling dignity itself. The street bends and you find yourself at the edge of a training ground, where the air feels heavier, sharper, charged with sweat and discipline. Here, the top knot shifts from ornament to battlefield practicality. You watch rows of samurai running drills, wooden swords clashing with loud cracks, armor plates clattering, and through it all every man's knot stays in place, oiled, tied, and unyielding. The shaved crown suddenly makes perfect sense here. Helmets, or kabuto, weren't just heavy. They were lined with padding that made full heads of hair unbearable. Without the shaved patch, a helmet would slip forward, block vision, and turn a warrior into an easy target. With the patch exposed, though, the helmet sat snug and secure, even as men lunged, ducked, or spun. You can almost feel the sticky weight of armour, the press of the helmet rim, and the strange relief of that bald patch breathing beneath it all. Historians still argue whether the knot itself was essential for keeping helmets steady, or whether it became more symbolic once designs improved. Some scholars claim the folded hair acted like a wedge, helping the helmet grip. Others believe the knot was already more about identity by the time of Edo, its battlefield function mostly a relic. Either way, watching men spar, you can picture how each fold once mattered as much as the curve of a sword blade. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some records, samurai complained about their knots collecting dust, mud, or even stray insects during campaigns. Imagine riding through rice fields, wind whipping, and then discovering a grasshopper clinging stubbornly to your carefully tied hair. Even the symbols of honour weren't immune to the absurdities of daily life, but beyond practicality, the knot carried morale. Picture warriors assembling before battle, checking not only weapons but hair. A neat knot could steady nerves, a reminder of discipline. A sagging knot? Maybe a bad omen. Superstition crept in at the edges. Some warriors believed a poorly tied knot invited misfortune in combat. Whether true or not, you can imagine how that belief might gnaw at you the moment arrows began to fly. And speaking of arrows, you picture the chaos of a battlefield. Spears clash, banners whip, horses scream. Through dust and smoke you glimpse helmets knocked loose, some men fighting bareheaded. In those moments the knot stood exposed, swaying with every strike. An enemy might grab for it, though that was risky. Too close to the blade arm. Yet the knot itself became a point of vulnerability, a place where dignity and danger intersected. After battle, the knot returned as a marker of survival. If it was intact, gleaming under torchlight, a warrior could still hold his head high. If it was cut or undone, shame followed, even if the man lived. That tiny bundle of hair, stiff with oil, carried more weight than bloodied armour. You notice something else too: camaraderie. In quieter moments, soldiers might help each other retie knots, checking angles before drills. The act became almost ritualistic, binding men together as much as shared meals or shared scars. It wasn't just hair maintenance, it was a gesture of trust. Touching another's knot here wasn't insult but solidarity, an exception carved out by necessity. But even in camaraderie, the knot's fragility loomed. Rain slicked it, mud stained it, wind battered it. A soldier could train for years in swordsmanship, yet a gust of wind could ruin his knot before inspection. You chuckle imagining hardened warriors huddling under makeshift cloths in downpours, not for their armour, but to protect their hair. As you watch the training ground fade into dusk, you carry a curious sense of duality. The knot was both practical and ceremonial, shield and ornament, battlefield tool and vanity project. It kept helmets steady, yes, but it also reminded warriors of who they were, what discipline demanded, and how easily pride could unravel. And so, as night deepens, the rhythm of clashing swords fades behind you, but the image lingers. Rows of men, knots gleaming, each fold binding them not only to helmets and armour, but to centuries of expectation. The road curves gently, and you notice how the atmosphere changes depending on where you walk. In Edo, the capital, the streets are alive with silk rustling, merchants hawking, and lanterns glowing like captured fireflies. Every samurai you pass wears his knot like a jewel, glistening with camellia oil, folded so precisely it could have been measured with a ruler. But step away from the capital and into countryside towns, and suddenly the knots tell a different story. Out here, they are smaller, rougher, less lacquered. Still knots, still proud, but weathered by daily life in fields and patrol routes. In the capital, grooming the knot is practically performance art. Barbers compete with each other to shape it perfectly. Symmetrical, upright, shiny enough to catch the flicker of candlelight. A polished knot tells everyone who you are. Merchants bow lower, peasants step aside, and even other samurai glance with a mix of respect and competition. It's a hairstyle, yes, but also a wordless announcement. I have leisure, I have status, and I have the means to maintain this crown. Meanwhile, in rural provinces, things are less glossy. A samurai working as a minor retainer might not have a barber on every corner. He ties his knot himself, quick and efficient, sometimes with cord made from hemp or straw instead of silk. It's still oiled, but not dripping. It's still folded, but not perfect. And yet, there's its own dignity in that roughness. A practicality born from needing to ride patrols, inspect rice stores, or walk muddy roads instead of strutting in Edo's tea houses. Historians still argue whether these differences were just economic, city samurai with more wealth versus rural warriors with more work, or whether clans actively encouraged styles to distinguish themselves. Some sources suggest particular domains had their signature knot shapes, a subtle way of showing loyalty. Others say it was simply geography. If you lived near Edo, you followed Edo fashion, but if you were in a mountain province, you didn't care if your knot sagged after a long ride. The debate isn't settled, but you can imagine both truths overlapping, like layers of oil on the same strand of hair. And then there's the human comedy. One quirky account comes from a travelling monk who kept notes about the people he saw. He wrote of Edo knots so saturated with oil that droplets ran down onto collars, staining expensive robes. Out in rural towns, he saw the opposite. Dry, straw-bound knots that squeaked when touched, almost rustic decorations rather than slick badges of refinement. Imagine the clash if these two groups met at a festival, the capital man dripping oil on the provincial man's straw cord, each horrified by the other's improper style. Even within Edo, the knot wasn't uniform. Younger samurai sometimes experimented with taller folds, daring to stand out. Older warriors preferred conservative, flatter knots, subtle but dignified. Gossip travelled quickly. Did you see Lord So-and-so's retainer? His knot was high as a pagoda. A small difference, yet in a society so obsessed with appearances, it was enough to spark whispers. You can imagine the way people today notice a colleague's haircut gone wrong. It's that same amused murmur, only here it carried stakes tied to honour. The countryside, in contrast, cared less for whispers. A knot was functional, tied tight enough to withstand rain and wind, oiled enough to keep dust away, and that was it. After all, a provincial samurai might spend his day managing crops or overseeing tax collection, not exactly occasions for showmanship. But even so, the knot marked him as distinct from commoners. Rough or polished, it still said, I am samurai. I belong to this class. The contrast also played out in art. In ukiyo-e prints from Edo, samurai are often drawn with gleaming knots, each line carefully inked to show shine. But in rural sketches, often made by travellers, you sometimes see looser, lumpier knots, drawn almost as an afterthought. It's like comparing a portrait taken for an official ceremony versus a candid snapshot while farming. Both are true, just to different contexts, and then you think about how people judged each other. Imagine an Edo samurai visiting the provinces, looking down his nose at men with rougher knots. To him, their style must have seemed sloppy, uncultured, maybe even dishonourable. Meanwhile, those provincial samurai might have thought city men ridiculous, wasting oil and time on something that would melt away in summer heat. Fashion clashing with practicality, an argument as old as time. Still, the knot bound them together. Whether lacquered with oil or tied with straw, whether tall or flat, it was the same essential signal. You belonged to the warrior class. It transcended geography, even as it reflected it. Without the knot, you weren't samurai no matter where you stood. One last image lingers as you leave this thought. A marketplace where men from different regions gather. Some knots shine like obsidian, others slump like tired ropes. Children stare, women whisper, and the samurai glance sideways at each other, silently comparing. No words spoken, yet everything understood. The knot, polished or rough, city-born or countryside-made, spoke in a language older than voice. The street narrows, lanterns flickering weaker, and you step into a place where the knot turns from proud crown to fragile tether. You find yourself in the company of prisoners, men who once strode through the city with gleaming folds of hair, but now kneel with bound hands and weary eyes. Their knots are still tied, but trembling in the night breeze, each one like a candle about to be snuffed out. For captives, the loss of a knot wasn't just cosmetic, it was devastation, humiliation, a sentence of living dishonour. To sever those folded strands was to cut away identity itself. You can almost feel the moment. The sudden lightness at the back of the head, the cold air brushing bare scalp, the shame heavier than any chain. Historians still argue whether this practice began purely as a martial punishment, or whether it drew from older traditions of haircutting as a sign of exile. In ancient Japan, monks shaved their heads to renounce the world, and common criminals were sometimes marked by forced haircuts. Did the samurai adopt this symbolism wholesale, or did they turn it into their own ritual of disgrace? Scholars line up on both sides, and the debate continues like an argument across centuries. One quirky record survives. A 17th century account tells of a prisoner who begged his captors to kill him outright rather than shear his knot. To him, death still held honour. Living without the knot meant being stripped of manhood, caste and dignity in one stroke. You can imagine the desperation. Better to fall by the sword than to live as a half-man, a ghost in one's own city. The act itself was chilling in its simplicity. The captive kneels, head pushed forward. A rival warrior steps up, blade poised. Not the killing arc of a sword, but a smaller, slower slice. The knot comes away, hair scattering to the ground like feathers. The man gasps, shoulders slump. He's alive, yes, but hollowed, reduced, as though his very spirit had been trimmed away with those strands. The watching crowd knows the meaning instantly. Children whisper, mothers clutch them tighter, other warriors glance away. It's shame that radiates outward, contagious in its intensity. Even enemies sometimes turn their faces, unable to watch. That's how powerful the symbolism had become. And yet, within the horror, humour lurked in the imaginations of ordinary people. Satirical prints occasionally depicted comical before and after images of men with proud knots one panel, bare crowns the next, faces twisted in shock. It was gallows humour, laughing at misfortune you secretly feared. Like memes today, these prints softened the edges of dread by turning it into absurdity. But there was nothing funny to the men themselves. Some prisoners reportedly tried to hide their cropped heads under scarves or hats. But in Edo society, concealment often made the shame louder. A missing knot shouted louder than silence. Without it, you weren't simply disgraced. You were marked, excluded from the brotherhood of warriors. Even after release, men who lost their knots rarely regained standing. They might turn to monkhood, shaving the rest of their hair entirely, a symbolic acceptance of exile. Or they might vanish into the countryside, living quietly as farmers, avoiding the stares of those who knew. The knot's loss was final, irreversible. You didn't simply grow it back. You grew into a different life. And then, a darker twist. Captors sometimes took the severed knots as trophies, displaying them like war banners. Imagine walking into a rival clan's hall and seeing your cousin's hair nailed to a post. More haunting than blood, because hair lasts. It doesn't decay, it lingers, a reminder of humiliation long after the man himself is gone. You pause in your wandering and imagine standing in that place, hair falling at your feet, scalp suddenly naked, heart pounding with shame. The quiet around you is louder than any battlefield. You're not dead, but you've lost the thread that tied you to your world. The irony settles like dust. The knot, so fragile, carried so much weight. A few oiled strands could hold up entire reputations, but once cut they dropped like nothing, trampled underfoot. Honour undone by hair. The street widens again, and your steps carry you toward a quieter, more solemn scene. This time, the cutting of the knot isn't forced by enemies or humiliation. It's voluntary, deliberate, ritualized. You stand at the edge of a tatami-matted room where a samurai prepares to retire, his armour stored away, his sword set aside, and his life shifting into its final season. Tonight, the knot will fall, not in disgrace, but in ritual release. The atmosphere is hushed. A few close family members kneel nearby, their faces solemn but calm. A low lamp flickers, casting shadows that ripple across the walls. The warrior kneels in the centre, robe folded neatly, hair still tied in the familiar knot. But he reaches up, hand trembling only slightly, and begins to untie it. There is no barber this time, no rival, no captor. Only the man himself, bowing to the inevitability of age or change. Historians still argue whether this ceremony was originally rooted in Buddhist practice or in warrior custom. Some say it grew from monastic tonsure, where men shaved their heads to renounce worldly ties. Others argue it was purely samurai, a ritual of retiring the body from service, severing the external badge of duty while still alive. The exact origin blurs in debate, but what's clear is that by the Edo period, cutting one's knot had become one of the most dramatic gestures a warrior could make. The sound is soft. Snip, snip. Strands fall onto folded cloth below. Each cut feels like a sigh. The knot loosens, uncoils and collapses, no longer stiff, no longer a crown. You can almost feel the weight lift, not just from the scalp, but from the man's shoulders. For decades, the knot announced him to the world as a warrior. Now it drifts away as he chooses a quieter path. One quirky detail: some families preserve the cut knot in wooden boxes, storing it like a relic. Imagine opening a lacquered chest years later to find a coil of hair tied with silk ribbon, still smelling faintly of oil. To us it might seem odd, but for them it was a tangible piece of honour, a reminder of the day a man gracefully stepped back from the stage. You picture the emotion of the moment. Family watching, some perhaps wiping tears, others silently proud. The man himself bowing deeply, perhaps chanting a prayer, perhaps whispering a farewell to the life he once lived. In that act he wasn't losing honour, he was redefining it, turning from the world of swords and duels to the quieter duty of ancestor, advisor or monk. And yet, there was danger in the gesture too. To cut the knot too early, before retirement was socially acceptable, risked whispers of cowardice. He gave up too soon, neighbours might mutter. On the other hand, to cling to the knot long past one's active years could seem vain, almost desperate. Balance mattered, even in this final haircut. You think of how different it feels compared to the prisoner's shearing. There, the act was violent, humiliating, a stripping away. Here, it's controlled, almost tender, an act of agency. Both end with hair falling to the ground, but one destroys identity while the other transforms it. The samurai sets the scissors aside. His scalp, partly exposed, shines in the lamplight. He bows once more, and in that bow he leaves behind the burden of warriorhood. Tomorrow he may don monk's robes, or simply live as an elder guiding younger men. Either way, he has shed his visible badge of class, cutting himself free from obligations sharper than any sword. And as you step away from that room, you feel the softness of the moment clinging to you. The knot falls, but instead of shame, it leaves behind peace, a quiet dignity, a whispered farewell to a life bound by hair, now untied. The night air thickens with the smell of sack and grilled fish as you drift into a rowdy tavern, where voices rise and fall like waves crashing against the shore. Lanterns swing on cords, casting wobbling halos of light across flushed faces. Here, samurai lean against low tables, cups in hand, laughter booming, while serving girls scurry with trays balanced on their palms. You take a seat in your imagination, quiet at the edge, watching the room churn. The knots are everywhere, tied, stiff, proud, and yet in this place of alcohol and bravado, those knots are also at risk. Because here, the most dishonourable act waits in the wings, the forbidden snip. Imagine the moment. A warrior, tipsy, laughing too loudly, his head tilting just a little too close to his neighbour. Another samurai, perhaps fueled by jealousy, rivalry or sheer mischief, fingers his blade. And in a flick faster than thought, snick. The top knot tumbles to the floor. Gasps echo. Sake spills. The room, which a heartbeat ago rang with laughter, now holds only silence. Cutting another man's knot without permission was more than a prank, more than insult. It was a form of social death. That folded and oiled hair was his passport to samurai identity. Without it, he wasn't whole. The gesture said, "You don't belong. You're nothing." And in a society where honour weighed more than life, that kind of insult could ignite violence as easily as a spark in dry grass. Historians still argue about the origins of this taboo. Was it a relic of battlefield custom, where cutting an enemy's knot symbolized victory and humiliation? Or did it emerge in the safer, more regulated Edo years, when warriors had fewer battles and more fragile egos? Some scholars suggest it was partly practical. Cutting off a knot made it hard for a man to wear his helmet properly. Others see it purely as a social weapon, designed to dishonor publicly in a culture obsessed with appearance. The debate hums along, unresolved, but the weight of the gesture remains undeniable. And then there are the stories, the gossip that travelled faster than couriers. One quirky anecdote comes from Edo's town talk. Two drunken samurai arguing over who had the sharper reflexes made a ridiculous bet. Each tried to snip the other's knot before the night ended. The tale says one succeeded, but his triumph lasted only seconds. Realizing he had just doomed his rival to disgrace, he begged forgiveness. Too late. The man without his knot stormed out into the night, honor shredded. The saying that grew from the incident, "Cut's sake, not knots," still carried bitter laughter years later. You can almost see the consequences ripple outward. The victim, stripped of his knot, has no choice but to challenge the offender. To ignore it would be unthinkable. Silence would confirm the shame. So swords are drawn, perhaps there in the tavern itself, amidst overturned tables and shrieking patrons. Blood mixes with spilled sake, and the room that was once filled with music and laughter now reeks of iron and fear. And all of it because of a few clipped strands of hair. The humiliation didn't end with the duel. Even if the man fought bravely, the missing knot followed him. Jagged hair stubble couldn't be hidden under silk cords. A scarf wrapped around the head might delay recognition, but whispers would spread regardless. "Did you hear?" His knot was taken. And in a society so tightly bound to visual cues, whispers were daggers. Kabuki theatre seized on this drama. Playwrights exaggerated the forbidden snip for audiences who shivered in delight at the scandal. Actors would strut proudly in full wig one moment, only to whirl around with the knot suddenly cut off in the next scene, audience gasping. The shame was palpable even on stage. Ukiyo-e artists joined in too, sketching prints of sly villains reaching for scissors, or humiliated men fleeing with half-tied stubble. It became spectacle, entertainment, even parody, but always rooted in the real dangerous taboo, and you can't help but imagine the comedy beneath the tragedy. Somewhere, surely, a clumsy slip of scissors in a barber's stall must have caused panic. Picture a barber gasping, customer jolting upright, blade in hand, both knowing the accident might be mistaken for deliberate insult. Did apologies pour out? Did customers storm away shouting? Somewhere in history, someone must have nearly duelled his barber over a crooked snip. The forbidden cut also carried political weight. Imagine a lord disgraced when his rivals spread rumours that his knot had been clipped in secret. Even without proof, suspicion alone gnawed at reputation. In a culture where appearances were currency, the possibility of a cut knot could destabilise careers, alliances, even marriages. But why such intensity? You glance back at everything you've seen so far. The knot wasn't just decoration, it was the distilled symbol of the samurai's place in the world. It tied helmet to scalp, yes, but also man to class, family to clan, body to duty. To cut it forcibly was to untie those bonds. That's why a single slice of hair could weigh heavier than 1,000 insults. Picture again the tavern where we began. The laughter gone, the knot lying forlorn on the floor, the victim trembling with rage and shame. The echo of silence presses in, thicker than the smell of sake. He will rise, sword in hand, and whether he kills or dies, the story will live on. Others will whisper it in alleys, paint it in plays, laugh at it nervously and gossip, but the man himself will never escape it. The knot was his crown, and crowns, once cut, cannot be regrown, and as you step back out into the cooler night air, the lesson lingers with you. Honour wasn't always lost in battlefields with clashing swords. Sometimes it was lost in the flick of scissors, the rustle of falling hair, the gasp of a crowd watching one man stripped of his identity in the cruelest way imaginable. The air grows livelier as you wander toward the theatre quarter, where the night vibrates with the chatter of townsfolk, the rhythmic pluck of shamisen strings, and the occasional burst of laughter spilling from the open doors of a kabuki house. Paper lanterns sway above the entrance, glowing like small moons against the dark sky. You drift inside, joining a tide of eager spectators pressing toward the stage. The scent of roasted chestnuts, sweat and incense lingers thick in the air. Tonight the knot will not be a private badge of rank or a battlefield necessity. It will be spectacle, costume, and play. On stage, actors appear in dazzling robes, colours so rich they almost hum in the torchlight. Atop their heads sit wigs crowned with elaborate top knots, crafted to perfection. From a distance they look startlingly authentic, as though real samurai have stepped out from the barracks and into the spotlight. The shaved crown gleams, the folded knot rises tall, the oiled sheen catches the glow of lanterns. You blink, forgetting for a moment that these men are not warriors. They are actors, many of them commoners, who, by law, would never be allowed to wear the knot beyond the stage. Yet here, within the wooden walls of kabuki, the forbidden becomes permissible, and every strand becomes theatre's crown. Historians still argue about just how faithful these wigs were to real samurai style. Some believe kabuki exaggerated them for dramatic effect, making knots taller, shinier and more elaborate so that even the cheap seats at the back could see. Others claim the wigs were painstakingly accurate, mimicking the fashions of Edo precisely, down to the sheen of camellia oil. Perhaps it was both, historical detail blended with theatre's instinct for spectacle. The debate continues in scholarly circles, but one thing remains certain. Kabuki turned the knot into something everyone could marvel at, even those who could never wear it themselves. Backstage notes from the period reveal a quirky, almost comical side of this illusion. Actors complained about the wig's weight and the way the oil attracted dust, smoke and even insects under the heat of stage lamps. Imagine delivering a tragic monologue while a moth flutters stubbornly in your knot, or feeling sweat trickle under the heavy wig as you try to maintain an expression of stoic dignity. Yet audiences never saw the discomfort. They saw only the gleam, the symmetry, the confidence of hair that looked indistinguishable from a warrior's pride. As the play unfolds, you notice how the knot itself becomes a character. A proud warrior struts on stage, his knot perfectly stiff and upright, declaring his strength and honour before he even speaks a line. Another actor enters, a sly villain, and the crowd chuckles knowingly as he gestures toward his rival's knot, threatening it with mock scissors. Laughter ripples through the audience. In real life, such a gesture could spark a duel, blood spilling over insult. But here, under painted backdrops and the cover of fiction, it becomes comedy, safe and exaggerated. The forbidden snip transforms into entertainment. Then the drama turns serious. An old warrior, weary from years of service, kneels under a dim lantern and cuts his own knot in ritual retirement. The audience holds its breath. Women dab their eyes. Men nod solemnly. The cut is not disgrace here. It is poetry, a performance of dignity. Even children sense the weight of it, watching the strands fall onto the stage floor. The knot carries power no matter the context, but on stage it becomes mythic, condensed into a moment of pure theatre. Outside of kabuki, townsfolk carried these images with them. Commoners, merchants, even farmers, none of whom could wear real knots, found themselves mimicking stage gestures in playful parody. Children tied cords around their heads, pretending to be warriors. Women giggled as their husbands teased each other by tugging at imaginary knots. Kabuki had smuggled samurai culture into every household, not by breaking the law, but by performing it in a way that blurred lines between imitation and reality. Ukiyo-e artists captured the craze. Prints of famous kabuki actors with towering knots were sold in stalls for pennies, hung in homes like celebrity posters today. Audiences followed their favourite performers not only for their acting, but for how magnificently their wigs imitated or exaggerated the samurai look. The knot became both fashion and fandom, replicated endlessly in woodblock ink. And yet, there was unease. Some samurai frowned at this appropriation of their symbol. Wasn't the knot sacred, reserved for warriors alone? To see common actors and townsfolk laughing over it seemed dangerously close to mockery. But the theatre was too beloved, too entrenched. Even samurai, slipping incognito into crowded seats, found themselves enthralled, laughing at the jokes, wiping tears at the retirements, unable to deny the knot's theatrical magic. You picture one such evening in vivid detail. The audience leans forward, breath held. The hero's knot is threatened on stage, scissors poised dramatically. The villain lunges, the hero dodges, the crowd gasps, some shouting warnings aloud as though their cries might alter the outcome. Children squeal, women clutch sleeves, men mutter oaths. It's only theatre, but in that moment the knot is alive again, not as etiquette, but as living story. When the curtain finally falls, the spell dissolves. Actors retreat backstage, wigs lifted from their heads, sweat dampening their hairlines. They return to ordinary lives, shopkeepers, townsmen, fathers, friends. But for a few hours they wore the knot as convincingly as any warrior, carrying the burden of honour and spectacle together. You step back into the cool night, lanterns swaying above, the crowd chattering excitedly about the play. For a moment you feel as though everyone leaving the theatre carries an invisible knot atop their heads, bound together by the shared dream of warrior pride. The knot, so fiercely guarded in daily life, has been lent out by the stage, transformed into public myth. And as you wander away, you realise Kabuki had done something no battlefield or barber could. It made the knot belong to everyone, if only for an evening. Pride, parody and longing, all rolled into wigs under painted lights, reminding you that symbols never stay locked in one place. On stage, they travel freely, catching every heart willing to watch. You follow the flow of the crowd leaving the theatre until the noise fades into quieter streets, and suddenly the world feels wider. It isn't just Japanese eyes on these knots anymore. You catch sight of men in unfamiliar clothes, loose trousers, wide hats, strange coats smelling faintly of sea voyages. They are Dutch traders, confined mostly to Nagasaki's artificial island of Dejima, but their sketches and diaries carry images of the samurai knot far beyond Japan's shores. To these foreigners, the top knot was exotic, baffling, sometimes comical. Imagine a Dutch merchant carefully drawing what he saw, sending the sketch back home, where curious Europeans crowded around to gape at this odd haircut. Bald on top, tuft tied at the back, shining with oil. To them, it looked like something between a monk's tonsure and a rooster's comb. Letters described it with fascination, sometimes admiration, often mockery. You can almost hear the laughter in Amsterdam taverns as travellers mimed the look for friends. Historians still argue about how accurate those early sketches were. Some claim artists exaggerated the bald patch to emphasise strangeness, turning samurai into caricatures with gleaming domes and ridiculous tufts. Others think the drawings were fairly faithful, and it was the European audience that misinterpreted them through a lens of unfamiliarity. Either way, what filtered back to Europe wasn't neutral anthropology. It was entertainment, curiosity, and sometimes ridicule. One quirky account from a sailor tells of trying to mimic the style himself, shaving his crown and tying the rest in a clumsy knot. His Japanese hosts were horrified, half amused and half insulted, and begged him never to do it again. What seemed like playful imitation to him was sacrilege to them, a breach of etiquette as sharp as an insult. Over time, Westerners came to link the top knot with the very idea of Japan. Travel books published in London or Paris often included woodcuts of samurai, knot gleaming under the helmet or tied stiff for ceremony. It became shorthand, show the knot, and everyone knew you were depicting Japan. And yet, even as it symbolised exotic pride, the captions often dripped with amusement, calling it strange, barbarous, or laughable. You imagine how odd it must have felt for a Japanese samurai, dignified and proud, to realise he was being turned into a comic sketch half a world away. The knot, which here carried the weight of honour, duty and class, was a broader punchline. Worlds clashed in perception, the same strands of hair refracted into utterly different meanings depending on who looked. As you keep walking, the lantern light fades, and you can almost picture those foreign gazes lingering. Dutch merchants peering from ships, English visitors arriving centuries later, all staring at the knot with equal parts curiosity and misunderstanding. To them it was hairstyle, to the samurai it was soul. The gap between those views was as wide as the ocean they sailed across. You drift along until the streets around you feel as though they are shifting in time, the wood and paper of Edo giving way to stone, brick, and the early rumble of modernity. It is the late 19th century now, and the familiar knots you've been tracing through shadows for hours are about to vanish. The Meiji government has risen, hungry for change, eager to shake off what it calls backward traditions. Among the reforms that swept across Japan, scissors became instruments of revolution. You imagine the decree being read aloud. Samurai and officials, once bound to their top knots, were now ordered to cut them. The knot that had been a badge of honour for centuries suddenly marked you as outdated, even embarrassing. Men who had lived their whole lives tying and oiling those folds now sat in barbers' chairs, hearing the snip of scissors not as insult this time, but as policy. The humiliation wasn't personal, it was national. Historians still argue over the motives behind this so-called haircut order. Some say it was pure pragmatism. Western-style uniforms and hats simply didn't fit over knotted hair. Others insist it was symbolic, a deliberate act to sever Japan's feudal identity and signal its entry into the modern world. The debate endures, but what you see clearly is the scale of the change. Whole cities echoed with the sound of scissors. Hair fell like autumn leaves. The streets grew full of men running hands awkwardly over bare crowns, suddenly self-conscious in a way they hadn't been since boyhood. One quirky tidbit from this period tells of men who couldn't bear to part with their knots. Some kept the severed bundle of hair in lacquered boxes, hiding it away as though saving a piece of themselves. Others wore wigs shaped like knots, hoping to appease both government inspectors and their own sense of dignity. Imagine the absurdity. Modern suit, Western shoes, and atop it all a fake knot strapped like a relic of the past. And not everyone complied quietly. In rural areas, men resisted, clinging to the knot as long as they could. For them, losing it wasn't modernization, it was surrender. Riots broke out, petitions circulated, and in some provinces the police had to enforce the scissors by force. Shame and defiance tangled together in the streets, strands of hair piling up like the remnants of an old world being swept aside. You pause and try to picture the atmosphere of those years. A samurai who once bowed only to his lord now sitting stiffly as a barber snips his knot away. A young official, proud in his western hat, sneaking glances in a shop window to see how odd he looks with a rounded scalp. Fathers returning home to families who stare in shock. Children tugging at the place where the knot used to be. An entire society learning overnight how to recognize itself in the mirror again. The knot, which for centuries had been armour, identity and etiquette, was gone in a matter of seasons, not by duel, not by retirement, not by scandal, but by decree. And as you step back into the fading night, you hear not the scrape of swords or the laughter of taverns, but the faint, relentless snip of scissors, cutting through centuries of tradition one strand at a time. The streets are quiet now, emptied of merchants, barbers, and drunken rivals. You wander into modern Japan, where skyscrapers loom over rivers once lined with lanterns, and neon replaces the glow of oil lamps. Yet here, in this sleek new world, you still catch sight of the knot, but only in rare places, clinging to tradition like a stubborn echo. Step into a sumo stable, and there it is, tied carefully atop wrestlers' heads, swaying as they train and clash. The shonmage, preserved in the world of sumo, has outlived the class that once made it famous. You watch the wrestlers kneel as their hair is combed and oiled by attendants. The ritual is painstaking, an echo of the samurai barbershop, each fold tied with precision. For these athletes, the knot is more than heritage, it is part of their very uniform. A sumo without his knot cannot compete officially, just as a samurai without his knot could not claim his honour. The continuity is striking. Historians still argue whether sumo's knot is a faithful descendant of the samurai version, or whether it evolved independently as theatre and sport merged. Some say it's a direct survival, transplanted into the wrestling ring when the samurai class dissolved. Others argue it was revived deliberately in the Meiji period, part of making sumo Japan's national sport. Whatever the truth, the knot lives on, stiff and proud, like a ghost from centuries past. One quirky modern tidbit. In sumo, the highest-ranking wrestlers wear a special ginkgo leaf-style knot, the ends splayed into a fan shape. It's meant to symbolize prosperity and strength, but to outsiders it sometimes looks like a samurai hairstyle gone flamboyant. Imagine an Edo warrior transported to today. He might laugh, or he might bristle at the extravagance. Either way, he'd recognize the lineage instantly. Beyond sumo, the knot lingers in cultural memory. Costumes in films and dramas resurrect it, letting actors stride once again as armoured heroes. Tourists snap photos with wax figures posed in old knots, unaware of how much weight those folds once carried. And in small ways, Japanese men still remember, by touching the back of the head, by seeing old prints, by carrying the story of hair that meant more than hair. You pause, reflecting on the long road you've travelled, from barbers scraping scalps in Edo alleys, to duels ignited by insults, to kabuki exaggerations and Meiji scissors. The knot has lived many lives. Now it survives in a single world, worn by wrestlers who bow before each bout, strands tied with oil just as their warrior ancestors once did. The echo is faint but clear. Identity, discipline, pride. A hairstyle that could humiliate, elevate or define, now mostly memory. Yet even as skyscrapers rise and neon buzzes, the knot remains somewhere in Japan's heartbeat, folded neatly, tied with care, whispering its history. And now, as the journey closes, let the pace soften. You've walked through candlelit barbershops and rowdy taverns, stood on battlefields and beneath theatre lights, listened to the hush of disgrace and the snip of scissors. The knots have fallen, the hair swept away, the centuries folded back. What remains is a gentle quiet, the faint rustle of memory settling like silk. Picture yourself reclining now. No need for armour or etiquette, no need for oiled strands or polished cords. The scalp is bare, the knot untied, the tension released. Each breath feels slower, deeper, as though the long history of honour and humiliation has been carried away with the hair. You are lighter, freer, like the samurai who set down his knot in retirement, choosing peace over battle. The city fades to a hush, lanterns dim, neon softens into glow. Even the echo of scissors drifts into silence. What's left is the rhythm of your own breath and the gentle awareness that every symbol, no matter how fierce, eventually rests. The knot lived for centuries, binding men to duty, and now it lives only in memory, held carefully by sumo, by theatre, by quiet tradition. So let yourself drift with it. Imagine strands of thought loosening like hair ties, falling gently into stillness. Imagine the scalp cooling under soft air, free from weight, free from expectation. Nothing to uphold, nothing to defend, nothing to prove, only calm. Your eyelids grow heavier, the knots have been untied, and so has the day. Rest comes easily now, steady as the breath of a sleeping warrior, quiet as hair settling on a floor. Sweet dreams.